Well, good evening. It's great to be here. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while. And as I got here tonight, I began to realize, I knew a lot of people here, but as I began to see faces and hear names, I realized there's a lot more people here that I know and that I remember from the past than I even realized. So it's a very good thing for me personally to get to be here, to be among you. And I look forward to those of you who I haven't met yet, meeting you and getting to know what's going on in your life and to find out what the Lord is doing in your life. And I look forward to the day when we won't have to rush on that. I think that's one of the things that heaven's going to be so wonderful about is all the unhurried moments where we can share the stories of how the Lord led us through all of the peaks and valleys of our life in this world and share those things without rushing at all. But we've got a few days together, and what little time that we will have together, I hope that we can make the most of. So thank you again to the elders and to all the members here for inviting me to be a part and to lead our studies and thoughts in these lessons. A little bit about me, for those of you who don't know me, I am Lawrence Kelly. I really am. I'm married to Janice Kelly. We've been married for a really long time, most of my life, it seems like, all the good years of my life. We have 4 adult children. The 3 oldest are married, and all of them have kids of their own. So I've got 6 grandkids and 2 more on the way. And our youngest son is 21. He still lives at home with us, but they're all serving the Lord, and that gives us great joy. I've been at Lost River for 23 years. This Sunday will be the 23rd anniversary for me at Lost River. I'll be spending it with you guys. But they're very long-suffering people, as you will come to appreciate, no doubt, this week. But I'm privileged also for the last 12 or 14 years or so to also serve as one of the shepherds there. The theme for our meeting this week is on drawing near, we're calling it. And this series of lessons grows out of a conviction that God is a healer, and it's good for us to be near him. That there's no better place that we could possibly be than near to the heart of God. And I hope that these lessons will bring that to the fore. We're going to talk tomorrow night about being with him in the secret place. And we're going to talk on Friday night about the content of what we might talk to him about when we're in the secret place with him. And then a little bit maybe off topic on Saturday, but then Sunday we're going to come back to focus on who it is that we're communing with in the secret place. Who is this God that we're drawing near to him? And is he the kind of being that it really is good to be in the presence of? I'm thoroughly convinced that he is, and I hope to share that with you this Lord's Day. This series comes out of some personal experience in my life. In the year 2020, I started noticing shortness of breath, a lot of fatigue, just sort of a general weakness, and ended up going to the doctor, and my primary care doctor gave me an EKG and said, yeah, we need to get you into a cardiologist. So I went to see the cardiologist, went through all the tests that they had, and I'll never forget the words when the doctor came in and says, you have heart failure. And I was like, you've got to have me confused with somebody else. I run, I cycle, I do all the things, and he's like, no, you have a very low ejection fraction in your heart. And he said, not only that, it's because most likely of the stress in your life. The stress that you're under seems to actually be like reshaping or twisting your heart. It's like mechanically reforming your heart because of the way that you're dealing with the stress in your life. And it's not just me that has, gone through a lot of stress in recent years. 61% of Americans feel that their stress levels are higher than ever, with 55% stating that this stress prevents them from enjoying life. Over half of Americans say that they are so much stressed that they can't even enjoy their lives. 25% of Americans experience burnout before turning 30, with the average peak burnout age of 42. And then chronic stress manifests itself in a variety of physical symptoms, including digestive issues, hair loss, reduced libido. It also increases the risk of serious conditions like atrial fibrillation, heart disease, high blood pressure. Overstress can lead to disrupted sleep patterns, persistent anxiety, and a weakened immune system. So it's good news tonight, everybody. How about you? How are you doing? How are the stress levels, the anxiety levels in your life? You handling these things well? Which better describes you on the two lists that are on this screen? Exhausted, overburdened, feeling even on the threshold of burnout. Or, no, I'm pretty rested and ready, refreshed and renewed, and feel like the situation I'm in is sustainable. I think I'm pretty strong. I can keep it up for another 30 years, no problem. Well, which of those two lists reflects the cultural formation of the world, of modern American culture, and which of these lists reflect the formation of Christ's work and presence in our lives? In Matthew chapter 11 and verse 28, Jesus' great invitation is given in these words, come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus gives this invitation in the context of an exchange with the Pharisees, whose burden was heavy and anything but light. And he talks about how if people will come to him and respond to him, that he has a secret wisdom that is hidden from the people of this world. The people like the Pharisees, who like to burden people with heavy religious burdens. Or maybe the culture that you and I live in and inhabit, where there's a tremendous amount of pressure and idea of how we can succeed and how we can pursue a higher, ever higher standard of living or level of success and achievement in this world. This is a wisdom that's hidden from people who are subscribing to those philosophies. And Jesus steps in and offers us something that is entirely different. He offers us rest, an unburdening of our souls, where we can find that peace and renewal and restoration that we long for. One of the reasons, I'm afraid, that Jesus isn't as attractive to the world today as he ought to be is that too many of us Christians are just as weary and just as burdened as the rest of our American brothers and sisters. And so when they look at our hectic lifestyles, they assume that our God is just as oppressive as the gods that they are serving. And so why should they leave their Pharaoh and the slime pits that he has them laboring in, making bricks and mortar and building Pharaoh's storehouses? Why should they leave off doing that in order to just come over and serve a God who's just as much of a taskmaster as the one that they're currently serving? I mean, imagine if your neighbor was to approach you and ask you the question, how are you doing? And you could honestly reply to him, look, I'm feeling pretty good. I'm pretty strong. I'm refreshed. I wake up renewed every morning because the Lord's mercies are new every morning. I feel I'm doing really good today because I spent some time yesterday with my good shepherd, and he had me in the green pastures, and my soul is restored. I kind of feel like I'm tapped into a secret source. It's like this infinite resource of living water. And it's just replenishing me. It's just renewing me day by day. And so life is good. I'm doing well. How are you doing, by the way? Wouldn't that be a shock? Wouldn't that be a testimony to what it's like to respond to Jesus' invitation? Come to me. Come away from what the culture is handing you and step into and under the burden, the yoke that I want to give you, because my burden is easy. My yoke is light, and in it you will find rest for a weary soul. You know, much of our emotional and relational and physical problems are related to a lack of margin. What is margin, you ask? Well, thank you for asking. Margin is that space between our current pace and our absolute maximum limit. And again, the culture that we live in is constantly telling us that your current pace needs to come right up next to your absolute limit. It tells us to do that with really everything in life. You know, you need to spend 99%, let's be honest, they tell us you need to spend 110% of every dollar you earn. And as Janice and I were told when we bought our first car, the car salesman told us smart people live on other people's money. Why not borrow 2 cars? So they want you to exceed your actual limits. And the same thing applies to our time, to our schedules. The world says, no, you've got to squeeze every bit out of your time and fill it with as much activity as you possibly can. But the reality is, and you know this as well as I do, as that margin decreases, as the space between what we on our best day could do and then what we are doing every day, as that space gets tighter and tighter, the stress gets greater and greater. And as the stress increases, our satisfaction in living decreases. Our standard of living may go up, but our quality of life takes a hit. And pretty soon, we also find that in that space, decreasing space, we find ourselves in more and more conflict with the people we love. More frequently and intense those conflicts become because we are so overburdened and stressed out. If you're like me, often you think about that and your response is, well, yeah, I just need more time. You ever said that? I just need more time. If I just had more time, everything would be okay. If I just had more time, everything would work out. But the reality is we're not getting more time. But we think that that would be the solution to the problem, don't we? If I just had more time, then I wouldn't panic every time a friend asked for a favor. Need a little help. You ever get that feeling? We're moving next weekend, and you're like, oh no. And it's not just because you don't want to help moving. It's like, I don't have the time to do this. Someone says they're going through a hard time and could, use you to just come and be with them. And you just kind of get that panic feeling that I don't know where the minutes are going to come from to be a friend to the people in my life. Or we think if I just had more time, I could listen to my children, love on my children without being distracted. All my time at home thinking about work and all my time at work thinking about being at home. Or if I just had more time, then I could be a church member, an actual member of the body of Christ, doing my part, pulling my weight, being a part of the body and not just an attender. And I could seek the Lord in prayer and silence and solitude. I could actually abide in the vine and find peace and joy and rest. If I could just find more time. But the reality is, if God suddenly gave you and me 26 hours a day, He gave us a 2-hour increase in the amount of time, what would we do with it? My guess is that most of us would just do more of the same that we're already doing. But the truth of the matter is that margin increases by subtraction, not by addition. God's not going to give us 26 hours a day. That's not going to happen. You can fiddle with the daylight savings time or do away with it, whatever you want to do. But the reality is we're not getting any more time than we have. So if we're going to have more margin, It's going to have to come by subtraction, not by addition. Now, God wove margin into the fabric of the world that we live in when he worked for 6 days at creation and then rested on the seventh, establishing a pattern for mankind created in his image to follow. This became instantiated by law for Israel under the law of Moses, where every seventh day they were to rest. Every seventh year they were to rest. And every 50th year they were to rest for 2 years and do like a complete cultural and economic reset every 50 years. Now, we're not under the law of Moses. I totally get that. But when we ignore the principles, the principles that God intended to instruct mankind and humanity with when he gave Israel those laws, or when he set the example that he did for us all in creation, we ignore those principles to our peril. And in our idolatrous devotion to productivity, we fall for the lies that we cannot prosper unless we are pushing, unless we are crushing it every day, unless we are leveraging our time, our money to the maximum every moment. And we think there's just no other way to do it. I mean, everything is made in the margins, we say, which, is why Chick-fil-A is such a failing company, because they take a day off. You just can't, that business model just will not work, right? Or for me, going back to what I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson, in 2020, when the doctor told me, you have heart failure, I began to make serious changes immediately in the way that I was living. I was taking no days off and crushing it, going at it as hard as I could all the time. And realized, this has got to change. He tells me this has got to change. I know this has got to change. I can feel, if I'm honest with me, that this is killing me, and it literally is. And when I learned to back off, thinking, well, it's going to mean problems for the church, because the church can't make it without Lawrence Kelly crushing it every day. But I've got to do what I got to do. Well, I start backing off, and very soon go back to the doctor, and he's like, good news, your heart seems to be getting back into the shape that it's supposed to be in, and your EF is back up into the normal range. And then something else really started to happen as I began to take time off from work. Our church really started to grow. We've grown over 20% in the last 4 years. And it's just been amazing to see what happened when I began to sort of live according to this principle of rest that God had shown us. Well, what would applying this Sabbath principle look like in your life? What would it look like for you to slow down, to make space, to rest, and to seek the presence of God? In my life, typically that rhythm looks like something like about noon on Sunday. We've pushed everything up to Sunday morning. And so when services are over after Sunday morning, for the next 24 hours, it's shut it down. It's rest time, it's family time, it's fellowship time, it's feasting time, it's delighting in the Lord, it's letting him lead me beside the still waters into the green pastures. And I'm finding that in doing that, the cup is overflowing and things are so much better. I don't know what it would look like for you. And we cannot legalistically impose some Sabbath rule on the people of God under the new covenant. But it is important for us to begin to think in terms of these principles, especially in the culture that we live in. There's nothing in our culture that is going to tell you to take time off, to recover and restore, and to get reconnected with the people in your life that matter most, and with the Lord who alone can restore your soul. So what would that look like for you? Marva Dawn, in her excellent book on keeping the Sabbath holy, W-H-O, holy, describes it this way. She says the Sabbath principle has 4 movements. She says ceasing, resting, embracing, and feasting. I think this is an excellent way to think about this, because you wonder, well, if I were going to take time off, what would that look like? For most of us, it we think that it would look like something like, binging on Netflix. If I just watch 24 hours of Severance nonstop, that would be restoring my soul. Well, it might be relaxing. You just order in pizza and watch TV for 24 hours or for 8 hours or for whatever, and that is relaxing, but it's not something that is restorative. It doesn't restore your soul. It will not connect you to the vine and make you more fruitful. It's really just a way of sort of self-medicating a mediocrity. And so we're looking for something entirely different. And in these 4 movements, she talks about ceasing. That's the literal meaning of the Hebrew word for Sabbath. It just means stop. Stop. And she talks in that chapter about the idea of it being practicing the sovereignty of God. Think about that for a moment. And when you think about what God was telling Israel to do, stop. And the reason that we resist that is because we think that the world simply cannot function without me grinding it out all the time. I can't put the work that I have done into God's hands and trust Him to bless that and cause it to be fruitful. I've got to be nose to the grindstone constantly, or it's not going to happen. And so ceasing, stopping, resting, and saying what's done is done, and the next period of time is going to be spent resting in the Lord, is practicing. It's not having a theology of the sovereignty of God, that He's in control and that He can take care of things when I'm taking time off. It's actually putting that into practice. It's a matter of sort of faith that works, but in this case, it's a faith that doesn't work, if you get what I'm saying. Ceasing. And then resting, as we learn to consciously during this period of time to focus on what the Lord has accomplished for me and how He is filling me up, how He is recharging me, and I'm leaning upon His grace. I'm trusting in His goodness. I'm reveling in His love. And then we embrace, and we do that in worship as we embrace God in worship and as we embrace our loved ones in fellowship. And then she talks about feasting, in which we enjoy the many wonderful blessings, tangible blessings that God has put into our life, and we receive them with thanksgiving and gratitude. That's a good way, I think, to think about how we can have counter formation, how following the way of Christ, answering His invitation to come to me, you who are weary and heavy laden, could push against the formation of the world. Paul tells us in Romans 12 not to be conformed to the image of this world. And we like to talk to our young people about what we typically think of as worldliness and not following along with the things that their friends are doing, but then we don't realize as adults falling into the modern American vision of workaholism as a form of worldliness. A form of not trusting in the sovereignty of God, of believing that the world can't function without me grinding all the time, as a forming influence of the world on my life, instead of learning to follow the rhythms of our Lord and trust in His goodness and in His restorative work in our lives as we rest. So we have to resist that formation from the world and step into the formative influence of Christ by resting with Him. So how can we get the needed perspective to know when to say no, to know how to slow down? And we need to do this on a daily basis, a weekly basis, and some other basis as we go along where we're hitting the pause button as we recognize that we're running on empty and find that restoring presence of God. Well, I think Psalm 90, verses 1 through 6, is just an excellent place to go. It's a psalm written by Moses, and Moses had a really remarkable life, to say the least. You can kind of divide it up into 3 sections. He had the first 40 years of his life as he grows up at the epicenter of power and influence in Pharaoh's household. And then he has that unfortunate event in which he attacks someone who is beating one of the Hebrew slaves, kills him. And when it's found out, he has to flee from that life into the wilderness, where he spends the next 40 years of his life as a shepherd. I mean, this is the monastic lifestyle. He is out there every day just with the sheep and solitude. And then we see him coming back at the end of that for his 40 years as he leads Israel out of Egypt toward the promised land and through the wilderness. And he lived, therefore, that 120 years, which is just a really remarkable thing to imagine living that long. And as he writes this psalm, he contrasts the everlasting God, the God who is, as he says, from everlasting to everlasting. Even though I know that mathematically this isn't correct, it's conceptually a framework that seems to work for us. From eternity past to eternity future, you are God. And he says, nested within that infinite reality is humanity. And for all eternity, for the time that we've lived, you've always been our resting place. We are nested within this eternal reality that is God, and you have always been our hiding place. And to you, 1,000 years, I mean, a 1,000 years is as a day is as 1,000 years. It's just a vapor to you. It's like a watch in the night. And in comparison to your eternal life, the life of man on this earth is like grass that sprouts up in the morning, and by the afternoon it's dry and withered away. And so with this great contrast between the eternity of God and the temporality of man, he says then in verse 10, the length of our days is 70 or 80 years, if we have the strength to live 80. Yet their span is but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass, and we fly away. We've been singing I'll Fly Away as long as I can remember, but I'd forgotten that song comes from, these lyrics were first penned by Moses millennia ago. We fly away. We're just here for such a short time, and then we just, like vapor, we fly away. So he says then in verse 12, Lord, in view of this, in view of your eternal perspective and our short wisp of smoke that is a life, teach us to number our days. Teach us to recognize how fleeting our time in this world actually is. And teach us this, Lord, so that, to this end, there's a purpose in this, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. That if we could learn to see things as they really are, if we could come to have your perspective on the days of our lives, it would impart to us a wisdom. The kind of wisdom, again, that Jesus contrasted in Matthew 11 when he invited us to abandon the wisdom of the world and come to him and subscribe to his wisdom and take on his yoke and his burden. Another way of putting this phrase would simply be, the Lord, teach us to live as if our days are numbered so that we can act wisely about what to put into it. What kinds of activities should we be involved in view of the fact that my life is going to be but a span, that my life is but a vapor, that my life is like grass that appears for a moment and then is cut down and fades away. What kinds of things should I spend most of my time and attention focused on? And not only that, what should I leave out? In view of the fact that I can't do everything and I'm not going to be here for very long, what are some of the things that really just in my life and the current activities that I'm involved with just need to fall by the wayside? And what things need to be reprioritized as I think about my life and its brevity? You know, if you live as if your days are not numbered, you'll fill them with things that you'll eventually regret. But if we get the wisdom that he's telling us about here, and we live as if our days are numbered, we will begin to say, I can't fill my schedule with things that don't really matter. And I cannot leave out the people and the priorities that matter the most. Bronnie Ware, some of you may have read her work. She was a hospice nurse for many, many years, and as she cared for patients in their final weeks and days and hours, she was very attentive to them, as many of the people in this kind of work are, and she began to notice patterns developing in the patients that she took care of. And as time went by, she began to write down her observations. And as she asked questions to people at this final phase of their life, that she eventually put into some columns and then finally into this book entitled The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying. I want to share with you just the top 2, starting with the second most frequently mentioned regret. I wish that I hadn't worked so much. Of all the people that she cared for in their final weeks and days of their lives, this was the second most frequent thing that she heard. I wish that I hadn't worked so much. When people at this point of their life finally get the wisdom that Moses had, that perspective of being able to look back over the period of their lives and realize how brief it actually was. And even though we may think of 70 or 80 years being a long time, when you get to the end of it and you look back, I can't believe how quickly it's gone. And so with that wisdom perspective, over and over again, she says, people said, I wish I hadn't worked so much. She goes on to say that this came from every male patient that I nursed. That's a remarkable thing. I don't remember how many patients she talked about in total. But she says they missed their children's youth and their partner's companionship. But the number one thing that people said that they regretted, they said, I wish I had had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. Got to thinking about that. The world has its expectations for us. Again, Romans 12, it wants us to conform to its expectations. It wants us to put on its yoke and push and leverage and crush and maximize. And yet the outcome of that is exhaustion, both mental and physical, and spiritual nihilism. As we reach the end of our lives and we look back and we wonder, what was it all for? And we realize that even if we accumulated a massive amount of wealth and possessions, that in this moment, as we prepare to leave this world behind, we realize that none of that brings any satisfaction nor comfort whatsoever. And we just I wish I had spent more time with the people in my life that would have mattered the most. And I wish that I hadn't been driven by the priorities that the world set for me, but rather perhaps I had answered the priority that Jesus called me to. Come to me. I'll show you a secret wisdom. I'll teach you to number your days so that you can gain this heart of wisdom. And the amazing thing is that when we, according to this expectation, I wish that I had done the things that I had in mind instead of what others expected. You come to realize that the yoke that Jesus has in mind for us, when we really think about what's at our best interest, is the same things that we wish we'd done for ourselves. The expectations that we have, not what others have. Jesus wants us to find rest and joy and peace and meaning in relationships. And that's what people on their deathbed say they wish that they had made their priorities as well. You know, what does the church need to be today? How can the church be light in the world and salt in the culture right now? I can think of few things that would make more powerful, more potent difference than if the disciples of Jesus learned to adopt the lifestyle of Jesus. We think about following Jesus, and we typically think in terms of doctrines and abstract principles, and all of that is important, and it is part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. But at its very core, at its very essence, being a follower of Jesus means to follow Jesus, to adopt as much as we can the kind of life that Jesus lived. John Mark Comer says that there were three primary ambitions of every disciple, a Jewish disciple, of following a master. They were, number one, to be with your master. Number two, to become like your master. And then thirdly, that you might be able to do as your master did. And that's what Jesus is inviting all of us today into. To follow me, to become a disciple, a learner of Jesus, where we begin to follow him so closely that the ancient Hebrew blessing that they would pronounce upon disciples is, may you be covered in the dust of your master, that we're following him so closely that his lifestyle becomes ours. We're with him, we're becoming like him, and we're doing as he did. I think if the church could adopt that lifestyle, it would be compelling to the world around us. People would notice that we're approaching life with a different wisdom, and that we do have a source of renewal that they seem to know nothing about. And so instead of wearing exhaustion as a badge of honor, burnout as a badge of honor, and thinking of our value and worth primarily in what we produce instead of who we are and who we love and who we are loved by, we could really stand out as light and salt in a culture that is decaying as a consequence of its idolatrous pursuit of productivity, of ever higher standards of living, of absolute exhaustion as we grind it out. We instead can come to Jesus in answer to his invitation. And that is his invitation. And this is where it begins, when he just says simply, come to me. Come to me. I wonder tonight if anyone here is weary. If anyone here is heavy laden. If anyone here has pushed it so hard for so long and the margin has become so thin that there is no space and the stress is just beating you down, that all of a sudden Jesus' invitation is really resonating with you tonight. And I want to come to the one who can give me rest, the one who can lead me beside the still waters and restore my soul. Maybe you're here tonight and you're weary from a life of sin, of knowing that you're not living in a way that is consistent with God's will for your life and what's best for you, and you're just worn down by what seems so appealing and so attractive at the beginning. You know, sin, it's very appealing at the beginning, but the longer you go down that pathway, it just grinds you down. Are you weary of a life of sin? Are you weary of operating under a burden of guilt? Of shame, of fear? Jesus wants to lift that burden from your shoulders. Maybe again, if you're just weary of the burden of trying to always play the status game, pursuing more and more money and wealth, achievement, maybe tonight would be the night for you to be able to move away from Pharaoh and into your Exodus. God's calling you. He says, my presence, he said to Moses and the people, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. You ready to leave Pharaoh? Are you ready to get out of the slime pit, making your own bricks and mortar to build his storage facilities so that when you die on your deathbed, you just say, you know, I acted like a slave even though I was free in Christ. I didn't have to do that. I didn't have to make those my priorities. Don't wait till then to look back with regret on the choice that you could make tonight to step into the freedom and the unburdening of yourself and of your soul that Jesus wants to bring you into. If we can help you tonight in any way in that regard, if we can pray with you, or if you have never confessed Christ as Lord and Savior and put him on in baptism, then wouldn't it be wonderful tonight for you to have that wonderful, indescribable experience of passing from death to life, from bondage to freedom, from burden to being light. We would be honored to help you with that tonight in any way that we can while we stand and while we sing.